Lecture 8, June 16, 1959, The Concept of the Self. I should like to carry straight on with the methodological remarks we had begun with last time. You may have had the experience of finding yourself in a discussion in which, instead of focusing on the subject in question, people have tried to pin you down by arguing that you have contradicted yourself. They mean by this that you have failed to use a concept consistently, or that before using a particular concept, usually a highly emotive one, it is important to arrive at a clear definition of it. For example, when discussing guilt, you regularly hear people say that such a thing cannot be discussed without its being defined, otherwise you just land up in contradictions. Similarly, it will not have escaped your attention that there is a certain kind of inferior philosophical criticism that makes a virtue of attacking writers like Nietzsche, or more recently, Spengler, on the grounds that they have been guilty of some so-called logical contradiction or other. This makes such critics feel good even though the reader does not have the sense that writers like Nietzsche are at all diminished in consequence. I do not wish to discuss the psychology of this approach. It is in reality a kind of compartmentalized thinking, that is to say, the thinking of the ordinary man, the petty bourgeois who likes everything to be neat and tidy, and who feels secure if his machinery does not break down and his ideas all function smoothly and without disruption. But such criticism makes us forget what philosophy is all about and what justification we can give for it, if, indeed, one is possible. Such a justification must go in the direction of saying that our aim is not to juggle concepts, arranging and rearranging them as neatly as possible like a stamp collection, but to deploy concepts in order to bring the subject, whatever it may be, to life. The unending problem arises because what that subject and that life are is not something we have in our pockets. Nevertheless, philosophy directs its efforts precisely towards the recuperation of what has been lost through this conceptual cleansing operation, this so-called contradiction-free, bland presentation of philosophical problems. This appears to me to provide the profoundest reason, the deepest justification of the claim that the philosophical interpretation of a text should focus less on the absence of contradictions, less on systematic consistency, than on its opposite, on the contradictions themselves. The aim should be not to nag away at these contradictions, but to discover the fissures, the chinks, that, if I may use an image from mountain climbing, enable us to get a foothold and eventually to reach the peak from where we can obtain a freer view of whatever intellectual panorama we are examining. Please, do not misunderstand me here. It is not the case that I despise conceptual clarity and order, by no means. It goes without saying that the so-called positive sciences cannot survive without precisely defined concepts and a discourse free of contradiction. But philosophy is really a matter of thinking on thinking as Aristotle defined it, and so the thought processes of logic and the positive sciences have to be subjected to a second critical scrutiny. This means that you cannot put too much reliance on a discourse free of contradictions. I should almost like to assert that the profundity of a philosophy, a concept I hope I shall be able to enlarge on in a more fundamental way in a later lecture, is not a matter of its capacity for resolving contradictions, but rather of its ability to bring to the surface contradictions that are deeply embedded in the subject under investigation, to raise such contradictions to the level of consciousness, and at the same time, to understand the necessity for them, that is, to understand their meaning. The discussion that I presented you with as a kind of model, a discussion of Kant's dualistic view of reason, will, I hope, give you some idea of my thoughts on this subject. To justify this in a more principled way, I would like you to consider a quite simple matter. The reason why I am placing so much emphasis on this is that all of you, I should really say, all of us, are conditioned to accept that our discourse should be free of contradictions. Consequently, the demand that we should liberate ourselves from this principle comes very hard indeed, and so you are right to expect me to explain why I proceed as I do, and not in some other way. The deepest reason I can offer is that we have no guarantee that the problem we are investigating is itself free of contradiction. If we were to assume that it is free of contradiction, that would be a prejudgment with immense implications. These implications would not be rendered more anodyne by the fact that in general we are not conscious of them when we privilege such contradiction-free knowledge. By insisting on this assumption, we are inserting a sort of clause in a will. We are assuming that the reality that is the object of our knowledge is identical with our knowledge, and that, in the final analysis, it is fully coextensive with it. This means that we would have begged the question, presupposing in advance a solution to the problem of knowledge, by assuming that reality is identical with us. For only when the knowing subject is identical with the object known can we conceive of knowledge as being free of contradiction. Only then may we assume that all contradictions will be resolved in the unity of our reason, in the unity of logical thought, because what we perceive forms part of this unity in our thinking from the outset and obeys its laws. But this assumption is one that we simply cannot take for granted, or so it seems to me. On the contrary, our entire experience, our entire living, pre-scientific experience, even more than our scientific knowledge, which in a certain sense has already been shaped in advance, compels us to doubt the validity of this premise. It is this train of thought that leads me to focus on the interpretation of the contradictions in a philosopher's arguments, rather than to attempt to reconcile disparate ideas. It is not hard to smooth everything out so that everything in a philosophy fits together. That is, to use Hegel's phrase, a step that is soon learned. It is not so easy, firstly, to realize how, just beneath the surface of a coherent body of thought, the various strands that make it up come into conflict with one another, and although the philosopher has sought to reconcile them, they retain their distinct identity. Nor is it a simple matter, secondly, to grasp just what a specific configuration of ideas means. This is a crucial methodological point, and I would like to cite two sentences from Hegel's Logic, from the Logic of Essence, to show you that the self-reflexivity of thought, that is, thought that enters into itself in order to discover its own essence, was already preoccupied with these questions. I do not say this in order to appeal to any external authority, or to strut around in borrowed plumes. I say it simply to enable you to see that what I am doing here is to apply an insight of advanced dialectics retroactively to philosophy itself. In section I of Book 2 of The Science of Logic, Hegel says, only when the manifold terms have been driven to the point of contradiction do they become active and lively towards one another, receiving in contradiction the negativity which is the indwelling pulsation of self-movement and spontaneous activity. For and a little further on, he adds, in general, our consideration of the nature of contradiction has shown that it is not, so to speak, a blemish, an imperfection or a defect in something if a contradiction can be pointed out in it. 5. It is in this sense that I would ask you to understand what I have to say to you about contradictions in Kant. I said earlier that Nietzsche is often subjected to quibbles about contradictions in his writings. The best known is that Nietzsche rightly thought of his ideas as the extreme culmination of enlightenment, but at the same time, as the philosopher who had in a sense repudiated rationality and who opposed it on the grounds that it was inimical to life. A further contradiction is that he described himself as a decadent, and simultaneously declared war on decadence and nihilism. When I said earlier that this kind of criticism of Nietzsche was the mark of an inferior mind, I can now add that Nietzsche himself did not simply overlook these and other contradictions from carelessness or inattention. On the contrary, Nietzsche's philosophy is remarkably coherent in a higher sense. It is constructed in a preeminently consistent manner. There can be no doubt that he was as acutely aware of the so-called contradictions as the worthy professors of philosophy, such as Rickert, 6, who have given him bad marks because of them. They undoubtedly originate in one of his very well-founded theses, that nothing that we know actually obeys the laws of logic, but that we employ a logic to organize the world in a particular manner. In the light of this, Nietzsche represents the conscious attempt to heal knowledge, to rescue it from this process of organization, from the illusion of its own logicality, but he uses the methods of logic to achieve this. Incidentally, there is a profound agreement between Hegel and Nietzsche on this point, even though Nietzsche knew very little about Hegel. Despite this, the affinity between them leads me to conclude that this healing of thought from the wounds that it inflicts on its own objects is an actual fact, the true task of philosophical reflection. All this by way of introduction. I should now like to move on to tell you at least something about what it is that Kant's philosophy expresses. That is to say, what it expresses over and above what it just states. To pick up the idea I mentioned last time, this involves telling you about ideas that exhibit this contradictory character for the most part, and indeed, about ideas whose expressive value and expressive force can only be read off from that contradictory core. 7. At the head of the list, I should like to place something that is perhaps less shocking today than it undoubtedly was in Kant's own lifetime, and continued to be long after. After what I have already said in this course of lectures, what I have to say now will not be exactly new to you, but I wish to elevate it into something of thematic importance. I am drawing your attention to this particular feature because I believe that by making it clear, it will provide you with the key to the critique of pure reason as a whole. Within the German tradition of philosophy, which as you know retained its dogmatic character far longer than elsewhere in Western Europe, Kant's critique of reason has been perceived essentially as a negative achievement. Later on it would have been described as a subversive, destructive achievement. You need only recall Kleist's famous utterance on the subject, or the epithet of the all-destroyer that was applied to Kant, 9 more recently. However, I believe that with the passage of time, the precise opposite has come to be seen to be the truth about Kant. The thrust of Kant's philosophy as a whole, and that includes the really critical work, namely the critique of pure reason, is aimed at salvaging, and the salvaging of ontology in a quite specific sense. He wishes to salvage specific fundamental spiritual realities that can be said to be valid for all time and that are secure from the vicissitudes of history as well as from what Kant would have called a reasoning reason. This definition of the thrust of Kant's critique of reason may appear astonishing to you at first sight, but I believe that it can be supported by certain passages in the critique of pure reason, even though these may conflict with yet other passages. I have in mind here the statement from the preface to the second edition that criticism is the necessary preparation for a thoroughly grounded metaphysics of science. 10. The only meaning we can give to such a statement, assuming that we take the words at face value and make no attempt to twist them, is that the preparation for metaphysics as a science must have been intended by Kant in a positive sense. Despite the contrary statement that metaphysics is not possible as a science, but only as the repository of the regulative ideas, and thereby as a purely practical discipline. It is my belief that the form of words I used before about the salvaging of ontology, even though it goes beyond this, can nevertheless be made to agree with the Kantian formula without doing violence to it. To do this we need only look at Kant's use of the term ontology. I believe, further, that the specific nature of Kant's project lies in this contradictory element, that is to say, that, on the one hand, the critique of pure reason is concerned with rescue, with salvaging ontology, while, on the other hand, some doubt is cast on this positive aspect. In other words, Kantian metaphysics is to be found in the constellation between these two poles, which cannot easily be reconciled. Listen now to the definition of ontology in the Progress of Metaphysics. Ontology is the science, as part of metaphysics, which constitutes a system of all the concepts and principles of the understanding, but only insofar as they apply to objects that are given to the senses, and can therefore be confirmed by experience. It is not concerned with the suprasensual, which is after all the ultimate aim of metaphysics, and hence forms part of the latter only as a propedeutic, as the vestibule or forecourt of metaphysics proper, and metaphysics is evidently viewed here in a positive light, and is known as transcendental philosophy because it contains the conditions and primary elements of all our a priori knowledge. 12. You can see here very clearly that, as the precondition of the possibility of knowledge in general, the Kantian concept of the a priori is not just to be understood in functional terms, that is, not just with reference to the constitution of knowledge, the grounding of experience. Over and above that, Kant ascribes a kind of ontological meaning, that is, a kind of ideal existence, to these root concepts, to the categories and forms of intuition, and it is this ideal existence that he is attempting to salvage. Moreover, he is attempting to salvage it in the sense that it is to be independent of all experience, that is, it should not be thought of as dependent on the vagaries of experience. At the same time, ontology is not something that exists purely in itself, but its existence in itself exists only for others, that is, it does not exist in a realm beyond experience, but only as constituted by another, and is fulfilled through experience. This is the crux, the point, as Nietzsche would have called it, or the wits, as Kant would have said. Here you have a very precise picture of the curious, we might even say, paradoxical, constellation of ontology in Kant. This salvaging of ontology really is a rescue at the moment of greatest need. At this stage of the Enlightenment we are looking at a rescue in the nick of time. The thing that has to be saved has almost drowned, and Kant only just manages to hold its head above water. What I mean by this image is that, on the one hand, concepts that are beyond experience, removed from the realm of relativization and retaining their absolute validity, may indeed exist. But, on the other hand, this intrinsic existence is not a hypostatization, that is to say, the ontological status of these pure ideas is defined by Kant as tied to existing reality. if I may express this by employing the all too common notion of ontological difference here, that is, the difference between pure existence and existent beings, then Kant would have said, even though this way of speaking would have been quite foreign to him, that there is such a thing as existence, but that this existence is only there to the extent that it refers to existing things. The moment it is severed from them, he would say, the moment it loses its relation to things in time and space, to individuated realities, to actually existent beings, it sinks to the level of a mere preconception. This means, then, that the ontological difference has the meaning that ta of ta are indeed constituted through the of, through pure existence, but that conversely, pure existence only acquires truth insofar as it relates to ta of ta. If dialectical philosophy was subsequently able to develop from Kant, you can see here very clearly how these two elements could interact with one another. In other words, the supreme concepts to which philosophy can aspire, the concept of form and the concept of actual existence Dasein, are each mediated through the other at the core of their innermost being. The only problem is that Kant did not make this the object of reflection. However, this mediation is implied. For, on the one hand, there can be no existing things, no factual reality, that is not constituted by the forms available to us. Factual reality is mediated by these forms. Released from these forms, factual reality would be entirely vague and undefined. In Hegel's parlance, it would be a nothing. Conversely, however, the forms are in their turn mediated by existing reality. This means that the forms, too, have no validity in themselves. There are no logical or categorical absolutes. They have no absolute status. They cannot for their part be turned into things or reified. They exist only insofar as they relate to the things that are thought of through them, to the extent that they connect with experience. In this respect we may say that dialectical thought is already contained objectively, already implied, in the Kantian theory, even though Kant himself left it in the shape of a crass dualism of form and content. But the crucial idea is that the properties he ascribes to the forms can only hold good, can only have existence, if they refer to contents, while the contents, for their part, remain quite indeterminate and cannot be the objects of thought until they have passed through these forms. This complex in fact expresses the idea that these two supreme concepts, form and content, are each mediated by the other. You can see here, then, that the dialectic does not involve sorcery, but that the transition to dialectics is a necessary consequence of the objective shape of Kantian philosophy. You can see likewise that the contradiction involved in the concept of salvaging is not a simple intellectual contradiction, but a dialectical one. That is to say, it is only possible to rescue ontology in the shape of this dialectical contradiction, in this pattern in which existence and existent things are mutually interrelated and interdependent, as opposed to an abstract conception of ontology as pure existence, standing in absolute opposition to existing beings. 14. However, everything I have said up to now is not enough to justify my contention that the critique of pure reason objectively contains an attempt to rescue ontology. It goes without saying, and I am the last to want to deny it, that you could find as many or more negative passages about metaphysics and ontology as the positive ones I have told you about, and as long as you are content to trawl through a great philosopher in search of simple proofs of what are said to be his intentions, the arguments and counter-arguments will never come to an end. As I have already told you, when you are attempting to assess a philosopher's thought, the least important evidence is that philosopher's own opinion about it. It is the same with a literary work, where it is just as idle to inquire into the convictions which inspire a work and which enable a writer to express himself directly. Thus, when I claim that the critique of pure reason was written to rescue ontology, I need rather stronger evidence and, above all, more objective evidence grounded in the subject matter than can be obtained simply from Kant's own opinion. I believe that I can provide this evidence quite simply by reminding you of the position of the critique of pure reason in contrast to the philosophy of David Hume. As you will know, or as you ought to know if you wish to gain anything from a course of lectures on Kant, David Hume applied an empiricist critique, that is, an analysis of the forms of our experience, which resulted in the dissolution of three fundamental concepts, three categories. He showed that they were really no more than conventional notions to which no substantial reality or, we might say in this context, to which no ontological reality corresponded. These three concepts are those of the thing, causality and the self. You must now bear in mind that one of the positive intentions of the critique of pure reason, and at the same time, one of the points at which we can obtain a glimpse of its ontological ambitions, is to adopt and continue this Humean critique. At the same time, however, Kant is concerned to turn Hume's arguments against him, with the consequence that these three concepts of the self, causality and the thing in itself are salvaged. 15 On the first point, we should say that he mobilizes a strict and powerful argument against Hume's analysis of the concept of the self. I believe it is important that you should make yourselves familiar with this line of argument, which only makes its appearance at a later stage in the critique. 16 This takes the view that the laws of association or custom, and in general all the elements through which the changing contents of consciousness enter into relations with one another, cannot be imagined save in the unity of a conscious mind. This brings us to the truly central concept of the critique of pure reason, one which we have not yet discussed, and yet which holds the key to Kant's entire solution to this problem, and that is the unity of consciousness. You cannot, and this is the burden of Kant's criticism of Hume, even conceive of all the psychological facts that Hume uncovers and which he uses to undermine the assumption of a self, unless you accept that they are included within the synthetic unity of apperception, or the I think that accompanies all my representations. 17 The concepts of the synthetic unity of apperception, and the I think that accompanies all my representations are not concepts we can fully analyze at this juncture. Instead, I should like to give you at least a very simple pointer to their meaning in order to show you the general direction of Kant's line of argument. Before rushing to put a metaphysical or speculative gloss on that, I think, you should merely think first of all of what the simplest experience will tell you about the unity of your own personal consciousness. For example, consider the laws of association, that is to say, laws that enable you to bring different ideas together because they resemble one another or because they are contiguous in time or place. To take two of the laws of association mentioned by Hume, 18, you would not be able to say anything about experiencing such associations if you did not conceive of them as your own experiences. Thus, if you have toothache today and someone else had toothache yesterday, but did not tell you about it, you would not be able to associate your toothache with his. Only if you yourself had the toothache yesterday would you be in a position to ascertain the similarity or difference in intensity between these two toothaches. This is a terribly primitive and basic example, but this very basic fact that there can only be knowledge of this kind where the individual has some continuity, this really is the key to an understanding of Kant. Moreover, when he says that the I think accompanies all my representations, this contains something else, namely the idea of spontaneity or activity, about which we shall hear more in the coming lectures. For the moment, however, we should be aware that this statement about what accompanies all my representations contains nothing other than the fact that all my representations, irrespective of what kind, do have something in common because I have them, that is, they are my representations and no one else's. This simple unity, which has its roots in psychology, has a kind of ontological significance for Kant. If this unity of personal consciousness did not exist, if there were nothing to unite all these different perceptions, then there would be no knowledge as such, but only a chaos. But this unity does exist, and in consequence, the self is a kind of basic ontological foundation of knowledge. I would add only that the problem of which subject is under discussion is in no way resolved, since the critique of reason has made it its task to ground empirical facts and not to presuppose them. This means that the empirical self, the individual person that everyone in this room is, cannot be taken for granted. On the other hand, the assumption of a specific individual consciousness which is able to unify disparate perceptions is absolutely indispensable to the Kantian critique. We thus find ourselves confronted by a contradiction, and I do not imagine, after what I have already said, that you will perceive this as an impudent criticism of Kant. Rather the contrary, in fact, namely, the contradiction that, on the one hand, the concept of subjectivity cannot be conceived of without the personal subject from which it has been derived, but that, on the other hand, the personal subject has first to be constituted and so cannot be presupposed in advance. Kant, however, could not bring himself to stop worrying away at this contradiction. In the attempt to resolve it, he kept coming up with new restatements in his various writings, notably in the Prolegomena, where his terminology differs from that of the Critique of Pure Reason. So much for what we might term the ontological significance of the concept of the subject in Kant. The actual inference that can be drawn from this that is of relevance for the overall plan of the work is that everything else, that is, all the specific forms which enable me to have any knowledge of whatever kind, has to be inferred from this unity of consciousness. This I think that accompanies all my representations. This unity ranks highest in the hierarchy of forms, and everything that can be thought is subordinated to it. It is the ultimate source from which the wealth of individual forms, of intuition and the categories, all arise. And as for the famous central section of the Critique of Pure Reason, the deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, you can now easily understand what is at stake here. Kant's task is to deduce the categories, the important, individual, basic concepts that enable me to organize my experience, from this very unity of personal consciousness, and from nothing else. That, in broad outline, is the strategy on which the edifice of the Critique of Pure Reason is founded. I do not wish to spend much time on causality. In Kant, causality is a category that follows from this unity of personal consciousness. It is nothing but the general form of a conformity to law, which compels me to synthesize the different phenomenal aspects of the same thing that succeed each other in time. He agrees here with Hume in not ascribing causality to things in themselves, that is, he does not conceive of causes naturalistically. In contrast to Hume, however, he believes that in ordered knowledge, a lawful succession of events, is only possible in the context of this form. Thus, whereas Hume would say that causality is merely subjective, Kant would reply, indeed, it is merely subjective, but this supposedly subjective element is the necessary precondition without which objectivity cannot come into being. In this sense, the category of causality, too, acquires an ontological meaning. In contrast to Hume, 19. Finally, we come to the concept of the thing, where the position is at its most opaque. At this point, I should like to offer you a little assistance for your own work on Kant. The concept of the thing or object is ambiguous in Kant, like very many of his concepts. And even if we have established that equivocal or ambiguous concepts do not come about by chance, but are in some way connected with the life of the thing to which they refer, this does not absolve us from the necessity of giving ourselves an account of the different meanings of a given concept. So please make a note of this. In the Critique of Pure Reason, a thing in itself means roughly the entirely unknown and indefinite cause of phenomena, the cause of the affections, the cause of sense data, which, as I have already said to you, are conceived as something indeterminate, but which in Kant are seen also to be caused by such an unknown thing. I do not wish at this point to explain how Kant arrives at such an unknown thing, and even to postulate a causal connection between it and our experiences. He posits this causal connection even though causality is defined as an immanent category in his writings, that is, a category concerned with the ordering of phenomena and not, say, with transcendent matters, inaccessible to experience. I believe that I have said enough by showing you that the seemingly dogmatic assumption of the thing has no explanation beyond the fact that he wished to avoid the duplication of knowledge by itself and to retain a concept of reality which is non-identical, that is to say, it does not simply coincide with consciousness, but in contrast to this concept of the transcendent thing in itself, which the neo-Kantians then attempted to appropriate and interpret as a marginal concept. As in mathematics, Kant also has a second concept of the object or thing, which we may call an immanent concept. According to this, a thing is nothing other than the laws that underlie the individual phenomena, the individual data of my consciousness. We should remind ourselves here that Kant maintained that phenomena could only be brought together with the aid of such a law, that phenomena could only be made to relate to one another through force, necessity. In this way he rejected the concept of the thing or else turned it into something quite vague and banished it from the gates of transcendental philosophy. But then he imported a second definition of the thing into transcendental philosophy as a positive fact, in contrast to Hume, who dismissed out of hand the idea of such a concept of things. Lecture